absolutely honored and delighted to have two great scholar practitioners with us this afternoon who have each written great books that I felt speak to each other in important and fascinating ways that couldn't be more timely. Ambassador Dennis Ross and Ambassador Michael McFaul, thank you both very much for taking time to be with us. Dennis has been with us for a day and a half. He gave together with Shibli Talhami a class in front of over 200 students at the law school yesterday.
Fantastic.
In the Democracy and Disagreement class. And we just, he gave a breakfast briefing earlier today and then a lunch for the Biyachad Forum of the Israel Studies Program. So with your time already, let me...
I hope he's being generously compensated for his time. I'm not going to ask that
Thank
question.
You, Mike.
Okay, all right.
No, that's a lot. That's a lot. It's a very good suggestion.
All right, we'll talk about that later. Thank you for that. So we have two gentlemen who don't really need a very detailed introduction, but just very, very briefly, I'll read out a succinct bio. Ambassador Dennis Ross is the counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he teaches at Georgetown University's Center for Jewish Civilization. For more than 12 years, he played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process, dealing directly with the parties at as the U.S. point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations, something that you could do in the 90s and sadly probably is impossible today. He also served for 2.5 years as special assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region. And he spent the first 6 months of the administration as the special advisor on Iran to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Ambassador Michael McFaul is former director at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He probably says that with relief.
That's the first time I've ever been introduced that way.
Right.
Just so you know, first time, because I was in Florida yesterday and they still think I'm
still the director.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we're accurate, and hopefully now you have the time to focus on great power competition and all the other things you've been wanting to do. He is also the Ken Olivier and Angela Nomelini Professor of International Studies in the Department of Political Science, and the Peter and Helen Bing Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He served for 5 years in the Obama administration, first as special assistant to the president and senior director for Russian and Eurasian affairs at the National Security Council at the White House. That was between 2009 and 2012. And then, of course, as U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation between 2012 and 2014. Now, scholar practitioners are people who combine rich real-life diplomatic and political experience with deep historical, philosophical, and analytical knowledge, and that they can bring together that practical experience and that academic knowledge to bear on policy challenges. I think that's quite rare. There are not a lot of scholar practitioners. There are scholars, there are practitioners, but we have a rare privilege of having two people who kind of embody the notion of being a scholar practitioner. And so we didn't want to miss the opportunity to have them engage in conversation with each other and with you. And that is especially because of these two books. Dennis's latest book, Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World, which was published in March of 2025. And just a few months later, Mike's Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder. Now, I think it's fair to say each book, I don't think you guys coordinated or discussed this. So each scholar pursued their own project, and they bring their own experience and own expertise to bear. Mike primarily on Russia and China. Dennis, I think you have chapters on 9 or 10 different settings, including a chapter on China. and elsewhere, but with an emphasis on the Middle East. And when I encountered the book, I thought that this would be sort of a wonderful inspiration for guiding us through a discussion about a very dynamic, rapidly changing world. And there were sort of three reasons why I thought these books kind of spoke to each other and could provide us with a great basis for a conversation. I think both of you, gentlemen, seek to make sense of this kind of new era that I think we're all struggling to find language for. I've sort of used the language of geopolitical fluidity, right? Of sort of systemic fluidity. We all have a sense that we've exited a certain world, and we're struggling to understand the new rules of the game, if there are any rules. Both of you, I think Dennis has a chapter on the decline of the liberal international order or statecraft in world in a new situation of world disorder. Mike's book uses the term global disorder. So I think that both of you understand that we have entered a new geopolitical era. I think it's fair to say that you both approach this question from a liberal internationalist perspective, and that promises to produce, I think, a very interesting conversation. I think both of you also think very deeply about organizing principles in world politics. Mike has structured his book around what I think was an axiomatic organizing principle of international politics within the liberal international order, the struggle between democracy and dictatorships. But I think you're both thinking in terms of how do we organize the world in the 21st century. And last but not least, you both reflect on the place of America in the world and how Americans can and should conduct statecraft, particularly vis-a-vis revisionist actors in the international system, China, Russia, and Iran. Now, we won't be able to cover everything. And I think that rather than delve into the books themselves, we want to use this opportunity to generate a conversation that's inspired by the books. It's one of the fun things about FSI. We can exploit a visit of someone like Ambassador Ross to engage with FSI scholars and with you in these types of challenging, but I think timely and important conversation. So in terms of the format, I think we'll have about 40 minutes for conversation among us, with a series of questions that I've prepared but have not shared with our speakers to maintain the element of surprise. And then we can have Q&A. We'll take questions from you, and Aliza, you will WhatsApp me with the particularly entertaining and well-formulated questions that we might get from people online. So if you are online, please don't be shy and submit your questions. Couple of last caveats. I will leave plenty of thematic space for questions. I won't ask directly about China or Russia and Ukraine. I simply don't feel that I have the expertise to ask the right questions about China and Russia, Ukraine, but I know that there are people in the room who will, and we'll leave that to Q&A. The last caveat, Dennis has another engagement this evening in San Francisco. I don't know how you do it. Well, I know how you do it because you've negotiated with Palestinians and Israelis for decades, so you have to have stamina. But he has another event this evening, so we're going to have to get him out of the building by 5:30 at the very latest. Okay, so good to go?
Yep.
Great, thanks. So let's start with some of these big systemic questions, this sort of theme of order and disorder, which both books kind of speak to, I think, in different way. I think you both take as axiomatic the decline of a certain liberal international order, what we might call a rules-based international order. And we have, and you both share a sense that we've moved from an orderly world into a disorderly world. Okay, but let's spend a few minutes unpacking that.
Yeah.
What is an orderly world and what is a disorderly world? What is the world that we are leaving behind, And how are you thinking about the new geopolitical space that we have entered? Dennis, do you want to start, and then we'll go over to Mike. Yeah.
First, thank you. It's good to be here. It's nice to be with Mike. We spent a lot of time together at certain points in the Obama administration. I would say, it's not like we had a world that was perfectly ordered and everyone basically accepted and operated on the same set of rules. That obviously was not the case. But what we did have, there were certain basic norms. And even when those norms were violated, the countries or powers that violated them felt the need to explain their behavior in a way that would still strike a chord and legitimize what they had done. That's an important thing to have lost, because now you can go ahead and you can do anything, and you really don't even have to justify it. You just do it. The fact is, you look at Putin and Ukraine, he was wanting to try to explain it in a way that could be understandable, but he really couldn't. But there still was this kind of a prohibition. We've lost the sense of prohibition right now. And when you lose that prohibition, it means one of the real constraints goes away. Now, what that means, you're going to end up having to come up with a set of tools or means that raise the cost to those who are going to engage in these behaviors. And when I talk about statecraft, I'm always talking about objectives and means, and marrying objectives and means. And here, we're now being put in a position where we're going to have to think harder about the kind of means that we can apply. Means and the tools they represent, it's not just military, it's not just diplomatic, it's not just economic, it's intelligence, it's also the public space and how you frame issues and how you put others on the defensive. So that's part of raising the cost to them. There are obviously concrete ways of raising the cost to them, but we're going to be challenged to do much more of that. In a world where basically there aren't norms, there aren't rules, there aren't prohibitions, you end up probably having to use more force. You're in a much better position where going in, others realize I have to somehow sell this in a way that's more acceptable and seen as more legitimate. When you lose that, how do you respond to it? You're going to be driven to use the military tool much more. I find it ironic that with President Trump, who I think genuinely wants to be seen as a peacemaker, now we see him focus more on the use of force. But one of the ironies is he doesn't want to use force in an open-ended way. He wants to use force in a kind of neat, clean, definitive, short-term way. You're going to find in a world where there aren't norms, it'll be harder and harder to use force that way and to succeed.
Mike, any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here with you, Dennis, too. We did work together in the Obama administration, and you said something really important, Amichai. There are very few people that write books and are good at writing books and also can serve in the government and are good at being in the government. I've met some folks that were good academics and then went into the government, they didn't do so well. I'm not going to name names. But I could. But you could. Okay, it's too dangerous for me. But Dennis was really good in the government in many ways. I just learned a lot being around him for the years that he was with us. He left before I did, but I mean, on Iran, we did a lot together for obvious reason, and it's really rare that we have people like him. And he's still in the game. Like he didn't, lots of people get out and they cash out and they just talk about their stories. And I just appreciate that you're not doing that, Dennis, because you could, and you're not. You're still engaged in it. And that's inspiration for me to keep doing too, as I just stepped down from this job I was doing for 11 years. I mean, we agree. Let me just echo a couple of other things and then put a question mark as to whether the system is completely destroyed or not. I just want to problematize that at the end. So one, when I teach here at Stanford, course on American foreign policy or international relations, I usually start with a map of Europe that is 6 minutes of European history. And it's 1,000 years of European history in 6 minutes. It's a great map, and it shows borders changing and might makes right, and the Mongol hordes and all of them, right? Napoleon, Hitler, Stalin, and then in 45. It kind of stops. The map stops, only for 10 seconds, right? Because it's short. It's a lot of history. And why does it stop? Well, of course it stops because at the end of World War II, the leaders of the world, and us first and foremost leading that world, said, we want to escape a world where might makes right, and you can just invade your neighbors and you don't have to explain to anybody. You didn't have to explain before, and 45 was this moment. And there are lots of norms embedded in the UN Charter, and not all of them worked out. And of course, collective security broke down pretty quickly, although it had its new moment, especially when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. But that kind of broke down. But there were two norms that despite all of the killing during the Cold War, there was millions of people died during the Cold War. Don't forget that. We know that. But there was two norms that, despite all of that, were, I think, relatively universal. There's some exceptions, but relatively universal. One, no more annexation. We're just going to knock that off. That is a norm that we are going to all embrace. And two, decolonization, end of empire. And that happened. And that was a brilliant, fantastic achievement from 1945. Even at the height of the Cold War, those were norms that both leaders in Moscow and Washington still said they believed. And I think the first major radical challenge to it, you already invoked it, was Putin, first in 2014 when he annexed Crimea, and second, the full-scale invasion where it's both imperialism, in my view, and it's annexation. Now, when I was ambassador, I was always, whataboutism. The Russians love whataboutism, and they would always say, well, what about Iraq, Mr. Ambassador? What about, and I left, by the way, before Putin invaded Crimea. He waited till I left. He didn't want me there. I'm kidding. I literally left the day before he invaded Crimea. And I'm using the word invasion on purpose because sometimes we use these softer words. And it's like, oh, he didn't really invade. No, they invaded and they annexed Crimea. But before that, I would get these whataboutisms, and Iraq and Serbia were always the biggest ones. And Dennis already alluded to it, but I think it's really important to underscore. Even in those two instances of us using military force, in Serbia, NATO, there was a group that blessed it. And people forget about 2003, and they say that was unilateralism and all that. But the U.S. Congress voted for that invasion. What's striking about this moment now, and then back when you had left by Libya, right?
No, I was there.
You were still there. You said that. So don't forget, when we're thrown under the bus, we're just like Putin and we're just like Trump. And this happens to me in the media all the time. 2011, when we used force, when the Obama administration used force in Libya, we had two Security Council resolutions that were passed. And by the way, the Chinese and Russians abstained, and they abstained on purpose. I was in the meeting with Medvedev when he explained why he was abstaining, because they knew that by abstaining, it was going to legitimate the use of force through the Security Council. What's striking about Putin's full-scale invasion, and back to 2014, he didn't ask anybody. I guess he asked his parliament, right? But that doesn't count. And he didn't care, and he just was going to do that. And especially in 2022, he just took the risks. And now by us threatening to do the same, we can come back to Venezuela in a minute, but especially on Greenland, we're just acting in a world with no rules, violating this principle of annexation and decolonization. And I think that's radically different, unprecedented. And I hope it doesn't happen, because then the rules are really, really weakened. What I don't know, just to problematize it, is, there's a dark period if you believe in the liberal international order or even international order, of course. It's also a pretty dark period for democracy. We have Larry Diamond sitting right here. And I've heard him speak about this many, many times. What we don't know is this just one of these, moments of recession that will have another pendulum swing, or is this a pivot that we never get back to? And I don't know the answer to that question when it comes to the international order. I would just remind you, it's not the first time we've been here. So, of course, we had World War I. We thought we were going to try to create a different kind of international system. And we all know it tragically failed. And by the way, that's when democracy, I think we got down to 12 democracies in the world, Larry, 1930s. Pretty bad. And if you're sitting around in places like this, writing my book, I read some of the academic literature, It's like you liberal Democrats, small L, small D Democrats like us. It's like it's so passé. Oh my goodness. You're a bunch of dinosaurs, right? The world is either going to be fascist or communist, but your ideas are dead. And that turned out to be premature. I think the late 60s, early 70s was another period where, Marxism, Leninism was on the march, and our ideas about global order and governance at home was also in recession. Well, that turned out to be premature, and the pendulum swung back. I don't want to say just because it's happened before, it'll happen again, but I do want to say I think there's way too much fatalism right now because we've elected this guy, President Trump, that doesn't believe in international order and rules. And I'm just paraphrasing what he just said in the New York Times, folks. He said, I basically can do whatever I want. The only thing that constrains me is my morality. And that really got my attention. So that's a hypothesis about international politics, but it's not a truism because there's millions of Americans who don't want to invade Greenland. There actually is I know there's tons of Republican senators that don't. I even know some of them personally, but even more amazingly, even a few of them have spoken up recently. So I just want to beware of the fatalism that we're just destined to return to the jungle because of this moment we're in, which is not to say we can go back and resurrect what we had in 91, 92. I mean, my whole book talks about that period is gone. But I think to just say it's over forever, I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet that democracy is in retreat forever and international order is in retreat forever. And the last thing I'll say, which is striking on this international order thing, and this might be provocative, but there are lots of countries in the world that really lament this collapse, and most of them are the least powerful countries in the world. So who wants international order? It's the countries that can be invaded, right? That do not have the power to do what Dennis talked about, right? And I think if there was a change in perspective from U.S. leaders, Democrats or Republicans, that this notion of fatalism, nobody would ever want to go back to it. I actually think that's wrong. I think that about NATO. I think that about a lot of multilateral institutions and a lot of relations with us. I think there's a great demand out there, to have a responsible America back. And I hope there is, because the last thing I'll say is the one country in the world that is not annexing countries and is not blowing up multilateral institutions and even abstains on resolutions criticizing the Russian annexation. We vote with the Russians today, just so we're all clear on that, is China. And they are playing, I think, and it scares me. I write a lot about it. It scares me. I'm not celebrating this fact, but they're playing a different game. They're telling the rest of the world, yeah, there's the crazy Russians and now there's the crazy Americans. We're the folks that believe in institutions, international order, that Trump just pulled out of 40 UN organizations and other multilateral. By the way, it barely got any news because there's so much news in the world today. He just pulled out of 40 of them in a heartbeat overnight. Chinese didn't pull out of any of those. And I worry that if we keep going down this road, those folks are going to play this international order card in a way that will not advance America's national interests and most certainly won't advance the interests of small d democracies in the world.
I just make
Please.
a couple of comments on what Mike said. I fundamentally agree with that, but I would note sort of two things. One, on this issue of whether or not the pendulum is going to swing or swing back, when you have policies that fail, they're pretty hard to sustain.
Yeah.
Right now, Trump looks successful.
Yes.
But it's premature to make a judgment that these are actually going to be successes. I'm not sure. It's quite striking to me that the Machado, who wins the Nobel Prize, is not the beneficiary of the removal of Maduro. The beneficiary is his regime. It's a kind of mercantile arrangement. I only know one oil company that is going to continue to be in Venezuela, and that's Chevron. I don't know others that are going to rush in there because the truth is, Chavez and Maduro basically destroyed the economy and the infrastructure. how much you would have to invest. And if the price of oil is going to be between $50 and $60 a barrel, it's not cost effective to make those investments. So the idea that this is going to be some kind of big windfall, A, I think is wrong, but B, I think there'll be questions that will be asked more and more about it. And even in the case of Putin, he's in my mind strategically weakened Russia in a dramatic way. And he can sell what he's doing all he wants. In the end, you can't fool it. It's like, Jim Baker, when I was working, once said to me, Dennis, if the reality is bad, it doesn't matter how much we spin it. And if the reality is good, we don't need to spin it. So, success or failure will begin to have an impact on perceptions of, okay, is this work or not work? And even in the case of Trump, if it turns out that what he's doing isn't working, I think we've seen it's not hard to make a 180-degree switch. And I wouldn't be shocked by that either. So the first point is on the durability of this. I share Mike's view. Don't despair and give in. In fact, there's all sorts of signs that this isn't necessarily going to be something that is going to endure. I couldn't help when you were talking. So Frank Fukuyama, who's a friend of mine, who was my deputy in the policy planning staff.
Our colleague, yeah.
Right. He wrote, his first big book was The End of History. Now, he wasn't saying history was over, but he was saying the ideological struggle is over. That's what he was saying. Obviously, that was a premature judgment. We all make such judgments. But so first, bear in mind, this is not written in stone at this point. I'll pause at that point.
Yeah. Let's move from the sort of systemic and structural to the question of statecraft, and the question of how we think about values, objectives, and means of seeking to shape the international order. Dennis, you wrote your original book on statecraft almost 20 years ago,
right.
And for many people, the word statecraft is sort of synonymous with diplomacy. But I think you take a different view. So, how is statecraft different from diplomacy or foreign policy or grand strategy or power projection? And secondary question. Has statecraft changed in a significant way since you first wrote the book 20 years ago?
So statecraft hasn't changed, and I'll come back in a second and define it and draw the distinction, but the world changed. When I wrote the first book, we were the uber power. I mean, one of the things I note is the rules of the international order may have been set up at the end of World War II, but they weren't universally accepted. When we became the uber power in 1991, then we could say, here's a liberal international order and the rules are accepted. But in fact, it's because, in a sense, we didn't have a competitor at that point. So when I wrote the first book in basically 2005, 2006, we were the uber power at that time. Suddenly, now we are facing a multipolar world where we're more constrained. But we're also in a different place than we were domestically. Yes, there was a debate on Iraq at that time, but there was still a consensus that the U.S. needs to be the leader in the world. The Democrats at that point weren't saying, oh, we don't need to be leading. We need to be leading. But they said, we can't lead this way. And so I wrote the new book, because I said, okay, we're in a different place. We don't have the same luxury to get things wrong that we had before. We don't have the same room for maneuver. And we have to be able to pursue a foreign policy that's more successful. And I was saying, all right, how do you do that? Well, you do that by integrating all of your means, because it's all the tools that a state has at its disposal make up the essence or the means of statecraft. The reason good statecraft is sort of defined by marrying objectives and means is because you're much more likely to succeed in what you do. Now, I always tell my students, okay, so you marry objectives and means. That's a given, right? It's obvious, right? Should always happen, right? But when you read the book, as I know you all will, the fact is we rarely do it, because frequently we don't think through objectives, or we don't understand the situation that we're getting into, or there's political factors that drive the decision to embrace an objective. Or sometimes you go in with one objective and it expands. I could give examples in each of these, but let me just give you an example of the last one. George H.W. Bush his administration conducted statecraft quite well. Typically, they defined the objectives in a way that fit stakes and feasibility, a combination of both, and they could marshal the means. When I say marshal the means, this is where the distinction. Diplomacy is a tool. It's a means. It's not the same as statecraft because it's one of the tools of statecraft. Diplomacy that is well conducted is one that inevitably has a coercive element to it. Leverage is something that you're always trying to apply because the essence of leverage is to get someone to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. So George H.W. Bush was actually, and especially with Baker, was very good at executing this. But as the example of you go in with one objective and you expand it, in 1992, there was a famine in Somalia. President Bush made the decision to send forces to deal with the famine and distribute food. I could come back to Gaza and talk about that as well. But in this case, the decision was made to send American forces there to distribute the food, and it was remarkably successful. Very quickly, we were able to deal with, arrest the major problems that related to the famine. And suddenly, Bush, really out of character, decided, well, you know, the famine came about because of the warlordism here, and the most severe warlord is in Mogadishu. Why don't we just deal with him? And once we deal with him, we'll basically deal with what was the root cause of the famine in the first place. Well, suddenly, because of the success of the first part of this mission, he changed the objective. We then got sucked into what was a civil war, which ultimately, after Bush leaves, and President Clinton had inherited this, produces Black Hawk Down. And we then get out. So here was a case where we defined an objective that was clear and narrow, and we had the means to do, and we understood what was called for. We didn't then understand the dynamics of the warlordism there. We didn't understand what it would take to try to contend with it. We didn't even have a kind of smart approach in terms of, well, are there some that you can align with against others? And in the end, we end up getting out of Somalia. And it's an example of you may have gone in with one objective that made sense, but your success led you to expand the nature of the objective.
Dennis, I'm going to ask you a funny question. Do you think that certain societies, perhaps democracies, tend to be generally more modest in the foreign policy objectives that they set to themselves, whereas others, cultures, other societies, perhaps authoritarian regimes, tend to be more audacious or more ambitious in the objectives that they set to themselves? Do you think that sometimes part of the culture of liberalism, of what we used to call the West, is being too shy in terms of ambitions, even when you have the means?
When it comes to the United States, my answer would be no. We have defined ourselves, our self-image has been historically defined by a sense of exceptionalism. We're selfless. When we go to help others, it's not because we're trying to take their resources. I mean, the present administration excluded. We have a larger purpose. Our values are universal values, and that led us at times to be overly ambitious in terms of what we could do. President Bush 43 had a freedom agenda for Iraq and the Middle East. And didn't really understand what we were getting into. That was a very ambitious set of undertakings. We have, I will say, this notion of American exceptionalism, it cut two different ways. One way it cut was, you know, we're selfless and we have perfected the model of governance, and therefore we're a model for everybody else. For those who defined it that way, we did not have to be active. We could simply serve as an example to others. Ronald Reagan's the City on the Hill, taken from John Winthrop. And I think, you know, the president we both worked for, President Obama, I thought very much he used to talk about we're going to perfect, you know, our example, and then we can serve as an example. So there were some, and this, if you go historically, Jefferson was much more in that mode. There are some who, instead of being passive about how to think about the American model, felt we had an obligation to export it. Woodrow Wilson clearly takes that view. Ronald Reagan was a Wilsonian in terms of language. He's somewhere in between Wilsonian and Roosevelt. In the case of, meaning Teddy Roosevelt, in the case of George W. Bush, he said he admired Teddy Roosevelt, but he was a Wilsonian in terms of what he could do and what he thought we could do in terms of exporting our model. Neoconservatives were enthusiasts who believed in our model is not only the right model, but because we have power that dwarfs everybody else's power, we can arrest and remove the threats to us that come from these, quote, bad actors. And we can transform the rest of the world politically using our military power. So we have a tradition, at least in part, of wanting to take that sense of exceptionalism and export it. In that sense, there were very few ambitions, or I would say there were very few limitations on our ambitions. You could say the Europeans, because they had a history of 2 world wars, became very reticent on the idea.
Especially the Germans, right?
Particularly the Germans, but not only the Germans, but I would say that history sort of dampened any ambition. I think it was Robert Kagan who wrote a book where he talked about
Americans are from Mars
and the Europeans are from Venus. Yeah. So I don't think liberal democracy necessarily excludes that kind of ambition.
No.
And again, part of it I think reflects what at least historically was an American political culture. I'll just close with this thought. Donald Trump, in many respects, was a reaction to this. He began talking about forever wars. He wasn't going to do that. But no, even though someone wrote in his inaugural speech, he made a reference to American exceptionalism, he's never really operated that way. I don't know, most of you probably won't remember. When he first got elected, he gave an interview right before the Super Bowl in 2017 with Bill O'Reilly. And Bill O'Reilly started describing Putin and how bad Putin was, and he said, "What do you think? We haven't done that? You think we're so great?" So pure, yeah, so pure. And he represents a reaction to this. What's striking is the way he's operating now. If I were to typify it aside from the notion that might makes right, I think that he's a spheres of influence person. And I've always had a problem with spheres of influence. And I describe it in the book as one of the models or one of the sources of models for what the U.S. role in the world should be. The problem with spheres of influence is at least twofold. First, where does it end? Who determines that this is where your sphere ends?
What are the boundaries of my sphere of influence and your sphere of influence?
Inevitably, it becomes a point of friction. I mean, we obviously know in the Russian case, there's a constant impulse to keep pushing it out.
Then there are regions of the world where that really comes to a point, the Middle East being one of them, right?
Yeah, where it's not defined, and
it's not defined,
where you're trying to
contestation.
Right, and exactly. But that's the second problem with the spheres of influence approach is, so you have all these countries that are absorbed in the sphere of influence. So what happens when the peoples within those countries decide to rise up? This is not a prescription for stability. It actually, I think, is a prescription for a lot of friction and conflict.
Not a prescription for stability and not a prescription for liberty for small and medium-sized states who find themselves in these competing spheres of influence. Mike, you are now leading an initiative on great powers and great power competition. Are you thinking about foreign policy and external policy in similar terms, or are you thinking about this in somewhat different terms?
Well, I'm not sure what the similars and opposites are in the question, because there were so many interesting things that Dennis just said. Let me just echo a couple of things, and then I want to try to answer. I'll just tell you what we're doing, and we can seek advice as to how to do it better. I think I was looking up on my phone to get the title of it. Steve Sustanovich has this great book called Maximalist, and he talks about 20th century, American foreign policy. And one of the things he would add to what Dennis just described is he has this period of pendulum swings, right? There's expansionist presidents, and then there's retrenchment presidents, and it's a reaction, action, reaction thing. And he codes rightly President Bush, W. Bush, 43, as an expansionist president. I want to say I actually had the chance to brief President Bush before September 11th and before his first meeting with Putin, because Condi was the national security advisor. She brought a bunch of us in to talk to him. It was fascinating in many ways. But if you had asked me then, that was May 2001, was he a Wilsonian liberal? I would say absolutely not. He seemed very realpolitik, and Larry's nodding. I think Condi was too, by the way, right? Yeah. So what can change that are these, we call them exogenous shocks. That sounds like a horrible thing to say about that horrific day of September 11th. And after that, he completely changed the way he thought, and he became this expansionist president. And I wonder, thinking about Trump today, who originally, and my book was published right as he was being sworn in, right? You have to I don't know why that is the case. I don't know if it would say with you. Of all these disruptive technologies, why does it take a year to print a book rather than 24 hours? But it still does. But I would have said he was going to be, in my coding, most certainly Obama was a retrenchment president in terms of our obligations to the world. But he was also a multilateralist, big time multilateralist, right? And those are different debates, right? To be engaged in the world or not, that's one debate. Engagement, isolationist, unilateralist, multilateralist, and then these two terms that I hate, but realism and liberalism, those are the terms that are used in academia. And I hate it because under the disguise, I would say, of realism, people do a lot of very unrealistic things. Trump calls himself a realist, and he's about to invade Greenland. That seems pretty unrealistic to me. But then I hate the word liberal, because liberalism, we know what Wilsonian liberalism is, but I was just in Florida yesterday talking to an extremely conservative group of people. And the moderator, by the way, is a former Trump ambassador. And when I talked about Wilsonian liberalism, he shook his finger and said, "We hate liberals around here." And that's when I had to tell him, well, you know that Ronald Reagan was a liberal internationalist. It's just a horrible term. But I'm sorry about it. I went on about that so long. But so the swinging thing is there. What I don't know is what happened between Trump 1 and Trump 2 that suddenly he's become neo-imperial. That was not on my bingo card. Yeah. It's not in my book, because the imperial, anti-imperial axis, which you need to use to explain American foreign policy for 250 years, I thought was over, after 45. So that's a very striking new thing. And again, I hope it just fizzles out. I don't know if it's real, but that we have to debate it makes it real. And that, by the way, that means then we're not debating what we should be debating, which is the threats from China and Russia, in my view, right? And this is the distraction that critics of the Bush administration and the Obama administration, we all spent way too much time on the part of the world that Dennis knows best, and our real threats were, in China, especially. We had these debates, were in the government, and the Trump people said that, and Bridge Colby, who now works for them, that was his argument before he joined the Trump administration. Too much in the Middle East, too much in Russia. We got to focus on China. And we're doing exactly the opposite right now, right? By having a debate about Greenland. And I would say to Venezuela too, depending on how it plays out. Second thing I would say, on the spheres of influence thing, that may have been a useful term in the 18th century, 19th century, makes no sense today. For a couple of reasons. One, where the borders are, I think that's a really great point. And when we pivot to the Middle East, which we should right now, whose sphere of influence is that? I think that's a really important question. Two, the point you made, and this is an argument I've had with Mersheimer for a decade, if you believe in spheres of influence and you don't believe that citizens of countries like Ukraine or Georgia or the people who live in Taiwan have any rights or voice in the system, obviously that does not usually work out well. And there's a reason, by the way, that empires overextended, fought too long, and then collapsed. think about, the British were better at their collapse, but the French weren't too good at it. Remember Algeria? The Portuguese were horrible at it. They wasted all their resources, and Angola and Mozambique fought forever, and it eventually triggered the collapse of their regime back home. If you've been to Portugal lately, it's a beautiful place, but man, they are not as rich as they used to be. And I think that's a real good lesson for us. Empires tend to overreach. Putin's done that in Ukraine. Without question, Russia could be so much richer, so much more respected had they not gone in this way. And I fear that we're inching back to that. On our project, just a small thing. I wrote this book. Took me years, and this is the longest book. Took me 6 or 7 years, depending on how we count, to write this book. Way too ambitious, and I'll never write another book again because of this book. It just killed me. It killed me. But there were two.
I think it's like childbirth. Women say that when they go through.
I'm not going to comment on that. I don't want to get in trouble with my wife. All right, all right. I did not, but what I wanted, a thing that I was struck by. And it's related to a couple of things you were saying earlier about statecraft. So one was, they're both related, but and now things have changed with Trump. But I knew a lot about the Cold War, so I compare the 21st century period of great power competition to the 21st century, right? And compare and contrast. My answer is it like the Cold War? Yes. And then ask me 5 minutes later, is it like the Cold War? My answer is no. And both of those things are true. And I think this debate about the new Cold War got a little too oversimplified for me. That's one of the arguments I have in the book. But what I was really struck by, I knew the Cold War. I know quite a bit about Russia. I know a fair about America. But I obviously didn't know enough about China. So I spent most of that time learning about China. And the great thing about that is there's some fantastic scholarship on China in the world. It's really good. And some of it is produced here at Stanford. And I own every book on China. I can't say I've read them all, but I own every single one published in the last 10 years. And it's really, really rich. What's not rich is two pieces. There's objectives and means to get those objectives. But where do the objectives come from? The intentions part. And I would just say this is a hard thing to do in autocratic places, but there's a vigorous debate about Chinese intentions in the world, and it's not solved. And that was frustrating to me that I had to punt on it because people I really respect disagree about that. Now, where the folks that think China wants to conquer the world, there are people like that think that. Where they get that wrong is what you said about objectives and means. If Xi Jinping has those objectives, which I kind of have to punt on because I'm not expert enough, they most certainly don't have the means to do that. And that'll destroy them. If he overreaches in the way that some predict that he wants to, they're done. And I feel comfortable about that. The other piece that was missing, and this is the research for the future, and is just because you have intentions, and we can track them to the best of our knowledge, and then you have means, and we can track means fairly well, right? You can add up GDP spent on military, you can add up boats and ships. But what's really missing in a lot of this literature, from my read of it, is how does that impact countries that are where the great power competition is being fought, right? The countries themselves. And the reason, my theory, reading this stuff, one, it's just hard to be an expert on everything, right? So you're a China foreign policy expert. You can't also be an expert on Zambia. I get that. That's hard. But the second thing is the great power theorists, and especially the theorists, they don't assign any agency to those that are the target of this stuff, right? And I just think that's a huge mistake. I mean, you guys are the experts on the Middle East. Can you imagine talking about great power competition in the Middle East and just think that Israel is just a recipient of this competition, or Saudi Arabia or Turkey? I mean, come on. But I would say that about Africa, South, I'd say about the entire world. And that's what I want to use the next several years to look at. All right, they all have these intentions, they all have these capabilities. How does it work itself out in Indonesia or Ghana or Venezuela now, right? I mean, by the way, Venezuela was one of our cases. We worked on it all over the summer, and we're doing a lot of updating now.
Just can I make one quick comment? During the Cold War, when you had a bipolar reality, you had countries like Egypt, all sorts of countries, they would play off the competition for their benefit.
Right.
Now it becomes more complicated. And I also did a study of China, not surprisingly. One of the things that China right now is trying, as you said, to present themselves as we're the adult, we're the responsible superpower, we're the one that respects these multilateral institutions. In fact, they're embedding themselves in them, and they're focused very much on building their soft power. Soft power is the power of attraction. When you give up that, you're giving up what is a really important means, because when you have the power of attraction, others are bound to embrace your objectives. But when others are embracing your objectives, it certainly adds to the weight you have, the leverage you have. So the Chinese are sort of smart in that respect. On the other hand, when they did the Belt and Road Initiative, one of the things they did is they got all these countries so heavily indebted that it actually undercut the source of their appeal. Now, the question is, are they learning? And also, apropos of what you're looking at, how much of these local countries, how much are they realizing, gee, we can actually embarrass them? We can expose them. It's just like during the Cold War, you play off the two superpowers against each other for your own benefit. Now, you still have a kind of competition, but in the case of China, when they're trying to sell a certain image, it gives these countries in the global South, it gives them leverage and agency.
Yeah. Can I add one thing to that, just in the spirit of conversation?
And then we'll move to Iran. And
And then I want to just spend the rest of the time on the Middle East, frankly. So I'll stop talking. Just to add to that about statecraft. So two things I just think the Trump folks are just getting radically wrong right now. In the research in this book, it's clear to me that in many countries around the world that are not great powers, there is a demand for our presence because they don't want to be part of a world dominated by China. And it's just striking. You see it in the data, about attitudes towards China versus the United States. I traveled in various places. I hear it anecdotally. Places like Central Asia, right, where we just completely. I used to be in charge of Central Asia when we worked together at the White House. I used to go there all the time, and there was a time when it was us and Russia, and then it shifted to Russia and China and us, and now it's just Russia and China. And the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs, they're like, can you please come back? We want you to be engaged, and we're just disengaging, and we're not there. And then added to that, we're unilaterally disarming in the instruments of statecraft that Dennis was alluding to. Yeah. Yes, you need the 82nd Airborne. Yes, you need the 7th Fleet. Yes, you need the 5th Fleet in Bahrain. You need all those things. And in my book, I say we need more of that. But we also need, if we can't call it USAID, call it something else. But you can't compete with BRI with nothing, and we just shut down our alternative to that. You can't compete with Russia today with nothing, and we just shut it all down. Radio Farda, I thought I saw a bus. Sorry? Radio Farda, we just shut it down. Wouldn't it be really good to have some means to communicate with Iranians right now? And, maybe, so you have to have those instruments to compete effectively. And then the other thing, just because you said it, and then I do want to just listen to you two talk about the Middle East. A famous book around here is called Force in Statecraft by Alex George.
I know.
You knew Alex too. Of course, he was my thesis advisor when I was a kid here. And he also wrote a lot about coercive diplomacy, as you know. But you used to always say when we were dealing with Iran, when we worked together, you got to have both tracks, right? The engagement track and the pressure track. And you were trying to get them to give up their weapons. And, we had that TRR, the Tehran Research Reactor deal. And I just remember Dennis said, they're not going to take this. And then we're going to pivot if I'm putting words in your mouth.
You're not.
This is a long
That's
time
what it
ago.
was.
I just remember very vividly. He said, "We're going to do this first. We're going to look like we're going to be cooperative. That's going to help us get the Russians on board right away.
Yep.
Then they're going to refuse it. You were right about that. I remember that. And then we're going to go to sanctions and the UN Security Council Resolution 1929. But we were playing both of those instruments of diplomacy, right? What's striking about Trump is he just plays the bully one, the coercive one. Right. And I want that on the table. But without this other piece on the table, I just think it wears out. And I grew up in Butte, Montana. I wrote a piece about this recently. It was a really rough mining town, and there was this one bully, Eddie, and he bullied me every single day for 3 years, and I had to do what he wanted me to do, and I did. And so he got his way. But did I like it? No, I didn't like it. Did I like getting beat up by Eddie? And so the day that I had the means to not be bullied by him, that ruined his racketeer operation up there on Granite Street. And that's what I worry about with these guys. They can bully, the Colombians. They can bully a lot of people, but man, they don't like it. And if there's an alternative, we'll lose those people in the long run.
Yeah.
All right, Middle East.
Let's talk about Iran. I mean, Dennis, you have a chapter on Iran. You've worked on Iran. Yep. Mike, your book actually deals with Iran quite a lot. You talk about.
Can I tell you a footnote about my book? The original draft about my book, Autocrats versus Democrats. It was not three countries. It was China, Russia, and Iran. Okay. I think their histories are very similar. These revolutions, post-revolutionary. Right. And then I also had on the other side Europe, right. And my editor cut them out for Iran and Europe, and they said
Mike, that's the next book.
I just want to tell you the story. They said Iran's too small and nobody cares, and then they said, and Europe, they just act like the Americans. They'll never change. So several years ago, but well, I'm done now. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about Iran. It's clearly very much on our minds, and not just because of the extraordinary bravery of the Iranian people, which really is sort of mind blowing. I think about what women and men in Iran are willing to do for liberty, and I think it makes a lot of us really think about what we should value in this world. But Iran is a critically important country in the region, in many respects, a kind of a buffer state, on par with Turkey, a country with a great civilization, tremendous state capacity, unlike some other states in the Middle East. But it's also a critical component in what has been called the revisionist axis: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, in some respects. So it's important not just in the Middle East, but in the great game that is being fought out. Dennis, I know you've been in conversation with people in the region. Mm-hmm. What is the state of the regime? I mean, it's almost a kind of a silly question to ask because it could change within 12 hours. But what is your best assessment of the state of this regime? And applying the statecraft lens, what should be U.S. statecraft vis-a-vis this regime at this point? And maybe you can talk a little bit about scenarios for where we might be going in the next hour and a half. Yeah.
Okay. Look, it's interesting that Iran developed a leverage over the region, in a lot of respects, Republican and Democratic administrations alike, because it created a proxy network. Why did it create the proxy network? One of the things to know about the Iranians is they're really good at having other people fight and die. They're not keen on fighting and dying, number one. But the proxy network was, talk about a tool of statecraft, it was a tool of great leverage intimidation. They came to dominate, effectively control 4 states in the Middle East: Iraq, Syria, I would say Yemen, and Lebanon. Now, what's happened in the since October 7th, the Israelis have dramatically weakened the proxy network. It's not gone away. But to give you a sense of how weak they've become, when Israel hits Iran and you have a 12-day war, Hezbollah doesn't fire a single missile. The Iranians have built up Hezbollah to have 150,000 rockets to be the deterrent against Israel hitting Iran. Or you can't hit Iran because you'll have 150,000 rockets. They don't fire. They obviously don't have anything like 150,000, but they still have, they probably still have 30,000. They didn't fire a single one. The Iranian-backed Shia militias in Iraq, same thing. They don't fire anything at Israel during the 12-day war. Hamas was not in a position to do it. The only ones who do it are probably the ones who are least controllable by them as an instrument, meaning the Houthis. They're the only ones. And what it says, first of all, is this huge investment that Iran made in these countries all disappeared very quickly because Syria was a part of it and Assad's gone. Now, if you want to understand the significance of that, it's part of what's driving what's happening in Iran now was I think the frustration and the anger over you're spending all these resources on the outside and we have water shut off 5, 6, 7 hours a day. By the way, during the summer, you had over 3 straight weeks of temperatures over 100 degrees in Tehran, and they have water shut off. You don't have electricity. This is a country that produces natural gas and oil, and you don't have electricity. Similar, shut off for multiple hours a day. The currency is, 1.5 million rials to the dollar now. The official rate at one point not long ago was 42,000. So if you have a bank account, completely worthless. So here you have a country that had all this leverage, and suddenly the regional proxy network is not what it was in any sense. It's dramatically weaker. Doesn't mean it's disappeared. It hasn't, but it's dramatically weaker. And now the frustration has boiled over. It's not new. You go back to the end of 2017. From 2017, almost every year since then, you've had these kinds of protests, not as widespread as this. What was quite widespread was the Women Life Freedom Movement, because Mahsa Amini was killed for not wearing her hijab appropriately. But even now, what you're seeing is all 31 provinces there isn't one province in Iran that is not affected by this. So what you're seeing is a perception of a regime that engaged in a level of coercion, convinced American administrations, by the way, that if we ever attacked them directly, they would set the whole region on fire. They had a kind of impunity. I will often say about Donald Trump, he gets some things right. Well, Larry says the law of averages. I would even say, I'm not even explaining or I'm not describing the reasons he might have done it, but removing the Iranian sense of impunity was also a very significant contributor to this, because it shows the strategy on the outside is failing, and now the regime looks weak, and suddenly you have a loss of fear. What's going on within Iran right now is a loss of fear fed by frustration, but fed by a perception, again, after 12 days of war, where they have no air defense. Israel has mastery over Tehran. They can do whatever they want. And you can't hide that. So what we're seeing now in Iran is, I would say, I can't tell you whether this is the end of the regime right now. I can tell you the regime's going to end. Maybe not now. Maybe they will kill enough people right now, but it's going to end. And it's going to end because those who are sustaining it don't believe in it any longer. I mean, those who have to be the ones who are doing the killing, the officers of the Revolutionary Guard or the Basij, maybe they're still able to live a decent life. But think about the people who are the ones who are down on the front lines, who are having to kill people they may actually know. They don't have water. They don't have electricity. Their salaries mean nothing. You're going to have, at some point from within the regime itself, you're going to have a backlash. Maybe not now. I had, before this, I thought, okay, when the supreme leader goes, that's going to be the moment, because there's no real clear rules of what happens. Someone in this succession will reach out to the public as a way of trying to gain some advantage and a sense of legitimacy. But I think this is now going to be accelerated because of what has happened. What I don't know, and there's no way to know, today, as you probably saw, Trump on Truth Social said, well, they've said they're going to stop the killing and the executions.
Right.
Now that becomes for him a justification not to act militarily. But what happens when it resumes? And if it does resume, I suspect, I would say I would like to see us using a lot of cyber to disrupt the ability of the regime, and especially the security organs. I want to disrupt their command control. I want to basically disrupt their ability to give orders. I would like to substitute false orders for the ones they're giving, because it'll create enormous uncertainty among these security forces who are probably stressed right now. I would prefer to do that. I have a sneaking suspicion that if Trump right now says, okay, I don't need to do it, my threats work, they're going to stop all this, there's no way they're going to stop the violence. No way. So I suspect if he then has to come back and do something, I think he will try to decapitate the regime. I think he will try to go for Khamenei. And I don't know I honestly don't know what that means. I mean, whenever you talk about regime change, it's always valuable to have some sense of what comes next. It's easy to say, okay, it'll be a military regime, it'll be more nationalistic. I think that's a fairly likely scenario. I'm dubious that we'll see the emergence of democracy there, not because I think this is a public that doesn't want it, but because there's no clearly organized leadership there. And one of the reasons is, of course, the Iranian leadership has done everything they can they'll arrest, kill, whatever, to ensure there isn't that leadership. But there also isn't a coherent opposition on the outside. And if you're going to have any shot at democracy within Iran, there has to be some organized leadership that is prepared to have a kind of strategy. The two of us actually did a lot together at the time when Mubarak fell. And we were focused on, all the different kind of steps that we could take. And I know one thing about the Trump administration, none of that's taken place. So, if a statecraft approach right now would be, we should be working with our allies, many of whom actually still have a presence in Iran, and we should be thinking about, all right, who can we identify? What can we do to be promoting the development of political organization? How do you work with them to begin to create more political structures and parties? Who can we be dealing with also to manage what can be law and order in this transition? There's a whole series of questions you would have to be dealing with, which it's quite clear to me we're not. Just like in Venezuela, we're controlling Venezuela, really? That's regime change where you basically take care of the leader, which is why I say, I'm thinking about President Trump in terms of what he did in Venezuela, and that's why it makes me think, okay, I will get rid of Khamenei. He lied to me, therefore I'm going to get rid of him, and that solves the problem. Well, that may just begin to change the nature of the problem.
Yeah. I think we only started scratching the surface on Iran, and we haven't spoken about Israel, Gaza, Palestine. I have a whole bunch of questions. I would have loved to continue this be like a Joe Rogan podcast for 4.5 hours. But we have to get Dennis up to San Francisco. So we've got 10 more minutes, and I want to open it up, and especially to students. I see Hisham, do you want to kick us off?
where is the memory of the United States policymaking lodged? Where is it? I come from a monarchical background. I know where it's lodged. It was very simple. You were with a leader that was around for 40 years, and before him, his father was 40 years, and all you had to do is go to a library and pull a manuscript out, and it was there. And here, there's no manuscript for all these interventions, and the same mistake is done. How can there possibly be talk in Iran today? I'm not a specialist on Iran, about bringing the Shah's son back. Something is not working. You want this to succeed? This is the last thing you want to do. And aligning yourself with a leader for the United States, it's the kiss of death in that same country. Where is the craft beyond the statesmanship? Why is there no learning curve?
I think in other words, he's asking.
Your postulate.
I think in other words, he's asking, who's the Dennis Ross of the Trump administration?
Or the Mike McFaul.
Well, no. This is about Iran.
I would say, look, some of the mistakes in the past, and I have case studies in this book because I'm trying to draw the lessons about what makes for good statecraft and what makes for bad statecraft. It's not just, I say it boils down to marrying objectives and means, but you can distill a set of lessons from the mistakes of the past, and you can also distill lessons from the good cases as well. Part of the problem in some of the areas that you're describing were when we face what we say are threats, and if you look at post 9/11, you were describing briefing President Bush in May, and Condi wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in the summer of 2000 that was highly critical of the Clinton administration because why are you doing all this stuff on peace around the world? Yes. It's great powers that matter, and that's where he was. Yeah. Right, and suddenly it changes after 9/11. To be fair to him, anybody who was president was going to be affected heavily by 9/11. When after 9/11, suddenly the great preoccupation was we have to prevent the worst weapons from being in the worst hands. The 9/11 Commission concluded it was a failure of imagination. People tend to forget when Dick Cheney went to the bunker, it's because at the time we picked up information that a nuclear weapon had been smuggled into the country. Turned out to be wrong, but at the time, because of 9/11, the worst possibilities were believed and taken seriously. So we clearly end up with an intervention that is driven by what I called a faith-based assessment, not a fact-based assessment. When you don't understand what you're getting into, you make these kinds of big mistakes. When you're driven by a high threat perception, it gets you to, I think, in a sense, you become preoccupied with, we have to deal with this, we have to cut it off. It dominates all thought, and it makes it, even in that administration, you ended up excluding the State Department and part of the intelligence community because they were seen by Donald Rumsfeld and Vice President Cheney as not getting the nature of the threat because they would come in with questions. It's not that there weren't people in the administration coming up with questions. They were coming up with questions, but they were dismissed and they were excluded. Can you imagine the CIA at one point wants to run a simulation on what happens if we go to war and we go and invade in Iraq. And Donald Rumsfeld is the Secretary of Defense, and he won't allow anybody from the Pentagon to take part in the exercise. Why? Because the people who are doing this exercise, they want to come up with all the problems to convince us why we shouldn't do it. As opposed to think, well, gee, maybe I should understand what all the problems are before I do it. This is very much clouded and shaped by the threat perception, which basically overwhelms everything else. Hubris. That does a lot to explain Iraq. Can I explain all of our others? Look, we go into Vietnam. Why do we go into Vietnam? Because we have a containment doctrine that is made universal, even though the author of containment says this should not be applied universally. We look at communism as being a monolithic bloc, when in fact it wasn't. We have to stop the expansion of this monolithic communism, but it wasn't a monolith. We don't recognize local nationalisms. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, but he was a nationalist first. We don't understand that. And that too is driven by a fear that is generated. So, I often said when I was negotiating, the hardest thing for me to overcome was fear. The fear of taking a step, it's going to expose us to a risk. We can't afford to take that. Whenever I could create hope, I always had more possibility. I could encourage people to say, look, we can take a leap because we have this possibility. But when fear was dominating, there was no space to create openings. So my long-winded answer to your question would be, when we have generated a kind of threat perception that scares us, it leads us to an overreaction. Doesn't mean, by the way, those threats aren't real. But it means you have to you got to break the threat down in a way that allows you to deal with it. One of the ironic things about what Trump did, at least with Iran, is he removed that sense of impunity which they had. That has made them profoundly weaker on the inside. That has contributed to where we are now. The problem I see is we don't have a strategy. We're not approaching this with a clear set of what our objectives should be, the means we have, the others we can be drawing on. Smart statecraft involves working with others who either have a knowledge base or they have resources and assets that you don't have. And they're additive. One of the problems with President Trump is he doesn't value alliances. He sees them as obligating us, and from his standpoint, they cost us. Instead of seeing they can be additive, they basically expand the resources we have available. If we're going to deal with the future of Iran, we should be drawing in all those who are partners on the one hand, but even with a country like China. In the Obama administration, I was sent to China in the fall of 2009.
Yeah,
and it was to convince the Chinese that the last thing they wanted to see was Iran with nuclear weapons, because that would produce a war in the Middle East. And I started by saying to them, you may think that we don't have common interests in the Middle East, but we do. We don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, and we don't want them to get close, because one of the things we know, it's going to produce a war. Israel will act, and don't think that we can stop them from acting if they're facing an existential threat. You don't want that. We don't want this. We have this in common. So we have to come up with a common approach on this. Even with China today, there's so many areas where, look, when it comes to pandemics, when it comes to environment, when it comes to nuclear proliferation, we have common interests. We need, again, from a statecraft perspective, how do you reframe the issue so you don't do away with your competition, because that's going to be there anyway, but how do you frame it by starting with, here are the areas where we have in common. Let's figure out how we can build on that. And that will allow us to figure out how to manage our competition. There's a lot that you could do. I wish that the current administration had people like the two of us, not because either one of us has all the answers, but at least we understood you have to think through systematically what you're contending with. You started by saying the two of us are people who are analytical and scholarly, but we're also practitioners. And the people who always affected me most when I was a student were those who could take ideas, but then I gave you a sense of how to apply the ideas. And that's what we were really dealing with. What statecraft deals with is both the what and the how of policy. Yeah. And there aren't, I agree with what you said at the very outset. There's some people who know the how, but they don't know the what. There's some people who know the what, and they don't know the how. This administration needs both.
And it's the only downside of being in the company of great scholar practitioners like yourself and like Mike, is that we can listen to them all day. I could happily continue to listen to you all day, but we can't, because you have to be in San Francisco in an hour and a quarter, and the traffic is building up. So please join me in thanking Mike.